The studio lights blazed down with a heat that felt heavier than usual, casting sharp shadows across the polished floor where every breath and every twitch seemed amplified by silence. Jonathan Roumie sat poised in his chair, hands resting calmly on his lap, prepared to discuss once again the remarkable success of The Chosen. He had done this countless times before, smiling into cameras, answering familiar questions with humility. But tonight carried a strange, unspoken weight that prickled along the edges of the set. The audience leaned forward, expectant, while the host rehearsed her opening lines beneath the hum of studio machinery. None of them knew what was about to unravel. Through a side door, Mel Gibson entered with an intensity that shifted the room in an instant. His footsteps struck the floor like a warning, and when he stopped just feet from Jonathan, his stare alone seemed to drain the chatter from the air. Without preamble, his voice cut through like a blade. "You are not Jesus." The words, stern and deliberate, struck with such force that even the studio's air conditioning seemed to stutter into silence. The audience froze, their faces a mix of disbelief and discomfort. The host faltered mid-breath, while in the control room hands hovered over switches, debating whether to black the screen. Gibson's presence loomed like a storm no one had been prepared for. He had not been announced, not scheduled, and yet here he was, a man whose own name carried controversy and reverence in equal measure, now standing uninvited to deliver judgment. Jonathan remained motionless, his expression unreadable, though beneath his composure his fingers curled slightly against his knees. He drew a quiet breath, closing his eyes for the briefest second, a whispered prayer forming in silence, so subtle that only those closest to him might have noticed. Around him the atmosphere bent tighter, as though the entire building was waiting for his reply. Gibson pressed forward, his Australian accent sharpened by conviction. "You need to step out of character. This idolatry is dangerous and you know it." His words echoed across the studio, reverberating against the stillness until even the audience members avoided one another's eyes, as if afraid to be caught taking sides. The floor director shifted nervously, his hand signaling frantic messages to the booth, but no one cut away. Something about the rawness of the moment was undeniable, and the director whispered into his headset, "Stay with it. This is real." Jonathan opened his eyes slowly, meeting Gibson's fierce gaze with a calmness that defied the tension. For long seconds he said nothing, letting the silence hold its own kind of weight. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing the flicker of emotion in both men's faces, the challenge in Gibson's, the measured restraint in Jonathan's. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, whispering under their breath, but no one dared interrupt. Then at last, Jonathan leaned forward, his voice soft but unshaken. "I know exactly who I am, Mel," he said. A pause stretched, deeper than words. "And who I'm not." 7 words, spoken with gentle clarity, landed like thunder in the silent studio. They cut through Gibson's accusations not with counterattack, but with humility that disarmed. The audience, suspended between shock and awe, barely breathed as they absorbed the exchange. In living rooms across the country, millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were witnessing something that would be replayed for years. Gibson's face flickered, his sternness momentarily unsettled. The host, frozen mid-intervention, could not find her voice. What began as an attack had turned into a cliffhanger hanging heavy in the air, with Gibson left speechless and the world waiting for the next word. The silence that followed Jonathan's 7 words seemed to stretch endlessly, as though time itself had paused to witness the weight of the moment. Gibson's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, yet behind the fury a flicker of unease betrayed him. Narration carried the room backward, into the restless nights that had led Gibson here. He had spent weeks pacing the dark wood floors of his Malibu home, speaking with Father Thomas during late prayer meetings, confessing that the success of The Chosen unsettled him. "They're worshipping the man, not the message," he had said with fire in his voice, his fists clenched as if holding onto a truth no one else dared acknowledge. To him, Jonathan had become the embodiment of a dangerous blurring, a man celebrated not for art alone, but as a figure bordering on sacred reverence. He feared the pattern he had seen before, icons replacing the divine, actors mistaken for messiahs. Each whispered amen in those private gatherings, fueled his conviction that someone needed to intervene and that someone had to be him. Yet the narration did not linger only on Gibson. Jonathan's journey unraveled in quiet contrast. Years earlier, he had walked empty Los Angeles streets, wondering whether acting had been a mistake, clutching unpaid bills and rejection letters. He had almost abandoned the craft, praying through tears in the solitude of his apartment. Show me if I'm meant to let go. When the role of Jesus came, it was less a triumph than a lifeline, a call that redefined his purpose. His crises of faith had carved humility into him, reminding him daily that his life was not built on fame, but on survival, surrender, and grace. While Gibson stormed into the studio armed with suspicion, Jonathan carried the memory of those nights when despair nearly consumed him. These opposing forces, Gibson's defensive authority and Jonathan's lived vulnerability, collided beneath the unyielding brightness of the cameras. The crew felt the collision too. A whisper carried from one cameraman to another, "He's trying to break him down." A producer, eyes darting between screens, muttered through clenched teeth, "Stay with it. Don't cut. This is history." In the audience, an older woman clutched her necklace, whispering a prayer, while a young man typed furiously into his phone, already sending the first lines of what would trend within minutes. The tension inside the studio was no longer confined. It was spilling outward, transmitted live to a world that rarely saw such raw confrontation. Jonathan's mind drifted briefly to a hospital room months earlier. A small boy, frail from chemotherapy, had looked at him with eyes too wise for 7 years. "You helped me remember Jesus loves me," the child had whispered, clutching Jonathan's hand with a strength his body no longer held. The memory pressed into him now, not as flattery, but as a reminder of why he carried this role. To Gibson it was dangerous idolatry. To Jonathan it was proof that God could use even a flawed vessel to reach someone in pain. He inhaled softly, letting the boy's words steel his spirit against Gibson's rising condemnation. Gibson advanced, his voice sharper, echoing through the studio with a severity that seemed aimed as much at himself as at Jonathan. "You don't see it, do you? This culture, this industry, it swallows faith and spits out idols. And you," his finger trembled as he pointed, "you are standing right on that line." His authority pressed like a weight. Decades of reputation, Oscars and notoriety behind him, towering over Jonathan's quiet presence. Yet Jonathan did not flinch. His calm gaze, unshaken posture, and silence created a power that words alone could not. The imbalance was undeniable. Gibson spoke with the armor of legacy, but Jonathan answered with the nakedness of humility. The studio audience shifted, torn between awe and discomfort, sensing that the real battle was not between two men, but between pride and grace, between suspicion and trust. Racism's subtle undercurrent stirred too, the way Hollywood decided who could carry sacred stories, who was deemed worthy of reverence, and who was not. To Gibson, guarding the faith meant policing the image. To Jonathan, embodying it meant disappearing so that something greater could be seen. As the standoff deepened, Gibson's breath grew heavier, his words laced with frustration, not only at Jonathan but at a world he believed was losing its way. His final demand thundered across the silent studio, sharp enough to slice through the unspoken prayers hovering in the air. "Do you even understand the danger?" The words hung in the air like a final judgment, but Jonathan did not meet them with resistance. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, each syllable deliberate. "I know exactly who I am, Mel," he said, echoing the words that had already pierced the silence. "And I know who I am not." The room tightened as if drawn into a singular heartbeat, and the cameras caught Gibson's face in ruthless clarity. His eyes, once burning with certainty, betrayed the faintest flicker of doubt, a crack in the rigid armor of authority he had carried into the studio. The muscles in his jaw twitched, his lips parted as though to strike again. But no words came. Narration lingered on his expression, the subtle collapse of a man who had entered certain he carried truth, now confronted by a humility that did not bend to his accusations. Jonathan's calm did not waver. His gaze remained tender but unflinching, and his words unfolded, not as a defense but as testimony. Every day I pray to remember that I am not him. I am only a man, flawed, broken, unworthy. But I know that through me, something greater can reach others. His voice did not rise, yet the conviction within it filled every corner of the studio. Gibson's hand gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white, as though holding on to the fragments of his argument. The audience sat motionless, and even the cameras seemed reluctant to blink. Jonathan drew in a slow breath, and then he spoke of Marcus. His voice softened, carrying the memory with a weight that bent the room toward reverence. I once visited a boy, 7 years old, battling cancer. Too weak to rise, too tired to speak much, but when he saw me, he whispered something I will never forget. He said, "You're not really Jesus, but you remind me that he loves me." The words, simple yet eternal, dropped like stones into the silence. The audience gasped collectively, the sound of suppressed tears spreading through rows of strangers bound by the moment. A woman clutched her chest and wept openly, her sob breaking the stillness. Gibson's face changed. The steel in his eyes melted into something more fragile, vulnerable, unguarded. Narration zoomed into the tremor of his lip, the moisture gathering at the edge of his eyes, the unraveling of the certainty he had brought with him. He leaned back, his voice stripped of its earlier ferocity. That boy understood? The question carried less like a challenge and more like a confession. The first acknowledgement that his grip on the argument was slipping. Jonathan nodded gently. He understood what many forget, that actors play roles, but love, real love, cannot be performed. It is lived. The silence deepened again, but this time it was not tense. It was sacred. Gibson exhaled slowly, his next words softer. His questions no longer sharp blades, but tremulous admissions. "You feel the weight of this, then? The danger of pride, of being mistaken?" Jonathan answered with a truth that glowed with quiet fire. "I feel it every day, and I fall short every day. But the answer is not to walk away. It is to walk deeper into humility. To remind myself I am only a vessel, never the source." His words struck Gibson not as rebuttal, but as release. The director's rigid posture slackened, shoulders bowing as though under the weight of revelation. A long pause settled, the studio frozen between confrontation and transformation. Then Gibson's voice broke through, lower now, humbled. Would you pray with me? Here, now." The request, born from brokenness, startled even the host, who covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The audience gasped again, but this time it was different, filled with awe. Jonathan's lips curved into a gentle smile. "I'd be honored," he said simply. The two men bowed their heads, hands clasped, the cameras capturing every detail as the studio dissolved into a cathedral of silence. Even those who had come to watch a promotional interview now found themselves part of something greater. Their breaths held as prayer filled the air, without words being broadcast. Narration painted the scene with poetry, the arrogant challenge that had begun with accusation transfigured into communion. Gibson, once armed with thunder, sat speechless in the quiet presence of humility. The moment was not victory or defeat, but something rarer. Grace revealed live to a watching world. When the cameras cut to black and the studio emptied, the echo of bowed heads and whispered prayer still lingered like smoke after fire. The world outside moved quickly to capture it. Clips raced across social media within minutes. Headlines screamed about the confrontation turned communion, and hashtags born in silence began trending with thunder. But inside Gibson's home, hours later, the spectacle gave way to solitude. He sat alone in the dim light of his study, scrolling through old photographs that reminded him of past glories scarred by scandals, of red carpets followed by public disgrace, of a career nearly buried under his own anger. His reflection in the glass of a framed photo of the Passion of the Christ blurred with the image of Jonathan sitting across from him, calm, unshaken, reminding him that humility could silence fury. Narration slowed into his thoughts, regret softened by grace. The realization that what had unfolded on live television was not an exposure of falsehood, but an invitation to something truer than performance. Jonathan, by contrast, returned to his modest apartment as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The same worn sedan carried him home, The same small church would greet him the following Sunday, and the same circle of friends would sit with him over coffee. When asked why he never upgraded, why he hadn't embraced luxury after global fame, his answer never wavered. "We're not the story," he told them gently. "Only vessels." Those words became both shield and compass, grounding him against the tide of adoration now surging higher than ever before. For every viral headline, he sought quiet prayer. For every invitation to celebrity, he chose the path of anonymity. The humility that had steadied him in the studio steadied him still. Meanwhile, the impact rippled outward like waves from a stone cast into deep water. Churches played the clip in sermons, using it as evidence of living faith in unlikely places. Acting programs dissected the moment, introducing ethics courses on the responsibility of portraying sacred figures. Critics who usually dismissed faith-based content admitted they had witnessed something raw, unscripted, and undeniably human. And in online spaces flooded with cynicism, millions replayed the footage not for scandal, but for solace. For a brief time, the world seemed united in awe of an exchange where humility triumphed over arrogance without spectacle, where silence carried more weight than fury. Even Gibson, never one for public vulnerability, chose to mark the encounter. Days later, he posted a rare photo on his social media. He and Jonathan standing side by side on the set of The Chosen, Gibson behind the monitor, Jonathan in costume. The caption read simply, "Not Jesus, just vessels." The image spread quickly, embraced by believers and skeptics alike as a symbol of reconciliation, of two men learning from each other. For Gibson, it was a confession. For Jonathan, a reminder. And for the watching world, a quiet testimony of what happens when pride bends to grace. Their unlikely friendship deepened in the months that followed. Collaborations emerged not out of publicity, but out of genuine respect. Panels on faith and film, where they spoke candidly of their shared brokenness. A short project about the disciple Thomas that explored doubt as an essential part of belief. What began as confrontation grew into communion, and what might have ended in scandal became instead a legacy of dialogue, humility, and hope. As the resolution unfolded, narration painted visual metaphors to close the circle. Gibson's once harsh voice, known for outbursts and accusations, now softened in prayer that no camera captured. Jonathan, though more famous than ever, walked back into obscurity willingly, blending into the crowd after church, declining the spotlight that others insisted belonged to him. The final reflection whispered across the story like a benediction. The words that silenced Mel Gibson did not end a conversation. They began one. And still, even in the quiet long after the studio lights dimmed, that conversation echoes.